So in this revision clip, we're going to be looking at the importance of individuals in the collapse of the Roman Republic. Now, there's a few ways that this question could be asked. You could be asked to focus on one particular individual and then compare their role with the role of other individuals. So, for instance, being asked about Caesar and then having to explain that Caesar obviously was important, but then there were other figures. Or you could just be straight up asked about individual politicians. So here are some examples of questions that you could get asked. So how far was Caesar typical of politicians of the period? In that case, you'd have to have a pretty strong understanding of Caesar's career, then compare him to some notable others. The other two questions: to what extent were individual politicians able to control decision making, and to what extent were problems caused in the late Republic by the growth in power of individuals, essentially require you to have key sections about individuals, obviously links to sources, and of course links back to the question. Now, I'm going to suggest a possible structure to deal with one of these questions in regard to the growth of power of individuals. Of course, this is a revision clip, so it's not a mark scheme. And I've chosen to focus on 4 key individuals. You could easily focus on other individuals, or you could focus on more than the 4 that I've suggested here. So I've suggested some type of discussion on Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, and Octavian. Now, you could easily make an argument that you might want to focus on someone like Cicero or Claudius, or the first Triumvirate as a group of individuals, or the second Triumvirate as a group of individuals. In regard to Sulla, we're going to be looking very briefly at his rivalry with Marius, as given to us by Plutarch, the prescriptions, the reforms of Sulla, and of course Sulla's precedents that he sets. For Pompey, very much a brief discussion of his early career, then his use of the Lex Gabinia and the Lex Minilia, the reasons for joining the first Triumvirate, and then reasons for the civil war against Caesar, as detailed by Cicero in some of his letters. For Caesar himself, we're going to have to just not entirely sure we're going to have that much time in an answer on these 4 individuals. Certainly the first Triumvirate is something we're going to have to ship, and massively rushed by some students is Octavian. Octavian is probably the most important individual on here, actually, who really does benefit from all of the precedents set by the 3 prior individuals. So Octavian is incredibly useful to establish how powerful individuals are. So let's look at, first of all, Sulla. Now, of course, the module picks up with Sulla's rivalry with Marius in regard to the Mithridatic command. Of course, we know that Sulla is given that command initially, then has to march on Rome for the first time when Marius's tribune Sulpicius vetoes that and gets it swapped to Marius. Sulla then goes off to fight Mithridates, and he's called back to Rome a second time. Now, we don't really need to go into too much detail here, but we can certainly use some archaeological material that shows how successful Sulla was in his actions against Mithridates, that put him in a position to be an individual with a tremendous amount of influence in order to shape Roman politics for the next century. So if we look at one coin that's issued by Caesar, this denarius, obviously we've got Venus over here and Cupid, and we've got a reference to Sulla at the bottom. In particular for this one, we've got a little reference to his military victories against Mithridates. We've also got the symbols of the Caius and Litus, symbols of traditional authority, and Sulla's imperium. So this is pretty much reinforcing and reiterating Sulla's generalship, Sulla's victories against Mithridates, and his position within the Republic. We can also look at the denarius on 82 BC. And this one again further consolidates that idea of Sulla as a successful general and an individual to shape the Republic. We've got Roma helmeted here, obviously the coin maker's mark there. Importantly is the right-hand side of the coin, where we've got the winged Nike up in the top, which is obviously the symbol of victory, the goddess of victory. And of course, Sulla in his 4-horse driven chariot is symbol of a Roman general celebrating a triumph. So we know Sulla marches on Rome for a second time, and we know he unleashes the prescriptions, and these are viewed pretty negatively by Plutarch, who's writing much later when he's covering Sulla as part of his parallel lives biographies, Sulla compared with the Greek Lysander. More importantly for this particular question are Sulla's reforms and the impact that he has as an individual, as a dictator. And Sulla's reforms are given to us by the historian Appian, who again is writing much later, but he's certainly in a position in order to write freely about Sulla. We've got the increase in numbers, where we have the idea of Sulla reigning like a sovereign, like a king, being dictator over the consuls. And it's Appian that gives us the information about the Lex Valerianalis in the second paragraph. And there is a little bit more detail, I've cut it down there, in regard to his reduction of the tribunician power. So as an individual, Sulla is having a tremendous amount of control and influence over the Republic. Later on, Sulla's going to be viewed pretty negatively. And we get that from a fabulous letter from Caesar to Oppius and Balbus in 49 BC, where Caesar is discussing his attitude towards captured Pompeians. And importantly, he does make a little reference to Sulla, which is quite handy to capture. Let us try whether by this means we can win back the goodwill of all and enjoy lasting victory, seeing that others have not managed by cruelty to escape hatred or to make their victories endure, except only Sulla, whom I do not propose to imitate. So he's essentially saying that Sulla resorted to cruelty and was therefore hated. Link to Sulla. So essentially, if we boil together our Plutarch, our Appian, our Caesar, and we can look at, we can see that he's certainly pretty toxic in terms of the precedents that he set. That you could argue so the destruction of the Republic 40 years or so after his period of prominence. Let's move on to Pompey. So Pompey is, again, one of the key individuals that wields tremendous power in the Republic. Plutarch, again, who is obviously such a great source for giving us a lot of snippets of information that we don't find in other writers because of his biographical focus. Pompey really comes to prominence because of his relationship with Sulla early on in his career. And you can have a little look at some of the key sections of Plutarch's discussion of Pompey, in particular his cooling of his relationship with Sulla, and why they fell out in regard to Pompey being given a triumph over other Romans. And certainly in verse 16 and 17 we get the idea of Pompey being sent to deal with rebel Romans. So first of all Lepidus, but also the rebel governor of Spain, Sertorius. And the important thing is here is this threatening tone and the threatening stance that Pompey makes with his army at various times in order to put pressure on the Senate. This is very much a case of an individual pressurizing the Senate. And what Plutarch says here is pretty effectively corroborated by Sallust when he provides us with Pompey's letter to the Senate. Now, of course, Sallust is an incredibly useful source because he's a near contemporary. So as a senator, mainly sort of a pro-Caesar senator, he certainly will have had access to senators that were in the Senate at the time of Pompey's early career. He may have even spoken to Pompey about these things. I don't know. But Sallust is a really, really useful source here. But the important thing is what we can get is the tone of Pompey's correspondence to the Senate. You are our only resource. Unless you come to our rescue against my will, but not without warning from me, our army will pass over into Italy, bringing with it all the war in Spain. So, we've got the idea of an individual threatening the state. Pompey further comes to prominence after his consulship in the 70s, when he reversed, 70 BC, when he reverses all of Sulla's reforms, along with Crassus, or a big chunk of Sulla's reforms rather, and gains further imperium and power with the Lex Gabinia and the Lex Minilia in the 60s BC. So in 67 BC, the Lex Gabinia is passed in order to deal with the pirate menace in the Mediterranean. He's given 3 years to do that, but does it in 3 months. And really, it's because that Pompey is given, despite just being a senator, that makes it particularly controversial. Fast forward to 66 BC and the move to give Pompey the command against the ever troublesome Mithridates. builds, and that results into the Lex Manilia. This is, again, incredibly controversial for the same reasons as the Lex Gabinia, but with the added extra that Pompey is going to replace an existing commander over there called Lucullus. And we've got a fascinating snippet of the debate about whether Pompey should be given these unprecedented powers between Catullus and Cicero. Now, the Catullus comments on the Lex Manilia come from Cassius Dio, and he's essentially saying that it's not proper for one man to be given too much power because power inevitably corrupts and turns into the monsters that Rome has experienced, like Marius and Sulla. Cicero, though, for his own particular motives that we'll discuss in other clips, argues that really Rome is built on creating new precedents to emergency situations, and Pompey's career has been full of special precedents created fully with the Senate's approval. And we get that from Cicero's Pro Lega Manilia speech. Pompey subsequently goes off to deal with Mithridates, but when he comes back, it's an entirely different Rome that he's dealing with, and an emboldened Optimates faction. And Pompey, after dealing with Mithridates, was pretty much assuming that he'd get what he wanted. He wanted his land for his veterans and his ratification of his settlement of the East, but he'd of course reckoned without Cato. So in 62 BC, Pompey returns from the East. He wants land for his veterans. And importantly, Crassus at the same time, Pompey's political rival is also frustrated by the Optimates faction in the Senate led by Cato. Now, what you could argue is that these individuals and their particular aims and ambitions again sow the possibility of the Republic's collapse. Due to Caesar's political maneuverings, Pompey, with his support of the army and the plebs, and the Equites, Crassus, with his immense wealth, combine their forces to create, or to allow rather, Caesar to successfully run for the consulship of 59 BC. And the first triumvirate using soldiers and intimidating the opposition. That's further backed up by someone who was actually living through these events, which is of course Cicero. And Cicero, writing in the midpoint of Caesar's consulship in around about July 59 BC, says these pretty depressing phrases about the first triumvirate and the level of control they've got. The Republic is finished, they're universally detested, and these men who in their rage against Cato have brought Rome to ruin. So we've got individuals led by Caesar at this point challenging the Republic and challenging the authority of the Senate. Caesar is able to pass an unprecedented level of legislation because of the ineffectiveness of the opposition. So Caesar's laws as consul in 59 BC really satisfy the other members of the Triumvirate, but also himself. So we've got Lex Campania and Lex Agraria, which gives Pompey kind of what he wanted. The Lex Publicani, which gives Crassus his Equites rebate. Importantly, the Lex Vitinia, which allows Caesar a platform in order to invade Gaul. So this is the one that gives him 2.5 provinces for 5 years. Interestingly, he also passes the Lex Curiata, which turns Claudius from a patrician to a pleb to become a tribune and obviously be deployed in order to exile Cicero. So continuing with Caesar, Caesar's now absent from Rome, pursuing his conquest of Gaul. It's not all easy for the Triumvirate, and we know that there are fallouts between Pompey and Crassus, so much so that they have to be brought together by Caesar again in 55 BC at Ravenna and Lucca. Here is Caesar taking the surrender, or accepting the surrender from Vercingetorix after the siege of Alesia. If you want to read up about Caesar's Gallic Wars, obviously there is the text of De Bello Gallico written by Caesar, but it's a fabulous little viewpoint into his mind and how he operates. So Ravenna and Lucca are conferences where the Triumvirate is patched up. Pompey and Crassus are to be given the consulship of 55 BC. Pompey then is given the governorship of Spain, rather, in absentia, and Crassus is given Syria in order to go and attack the Parthians, which obviously is not going to work out well for him. We've got a little bit of archaeological material about Caesar's conquest of Gaul in terms of another coin and another denarius that's issued by Caesar, which is further reinforcing his success in Gaul. So we've got those Gallic arms on the right hand side with the Celtic carnix and the axe, the animal head. And this is again a symbol of Caesar's conquest of Gaul and how effective he has been. Very quickly rather, in the 50s, our triumvirate finally collapses with the death of Crassus at Carrhae and the death of Julia, Pompey's wife and Caesar's daughter. And from this point, we are very much on a slippery slope towards a civil war between Pompey, who is freshly moving back over to the Optimates after repudiating Caesar's marriage alliance offer. He's now moving back over to the Optimates, and we've got this polarization of Roman politics that really has been emerging for the past 20 or 30 years anyway, but really crystallizing in this period. Again, we've got a fascinating source on this. We've got Caesar's De Bello Civili, where Caesar, obviously producing this at the time, of course it's propaganda, but it's still incredibly useful because it allows us to at least view how Caesar wanted his actions to be interpreted. And in De Bello Civili, Caesar is at pains to point out that the Senate have only moved against him in calling him an enemy of the state because they've been intimidated by Pompey and by Cato and by the other Optimates. And you can see this over here. Most of the Senate, intimidated by the declarations of the consul, by the fears of a present army and the threats of Pompey's friends, unwillingly and reluctantly adopted Scipio's opinion, blah, 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 that Caesar should disband his army. We've then got the civil war between Pompey and Caesar. We don't need to go into a tremendous amount of detail for that, but we can certainly pick up the thread after the civil war with Caesar's dictatorship and certainly the issue of him being declared dictator perpetus. Suetonius is a really great source on this one. Suetonius and his 12 Caesars. And certainly what Suetonius is trying to show here is he's trying to show that Caesar is, of course, looking after the people, looking after the army, but along that, angering many in the Senate, particularly his policy of clementia or forgiveness. That certainly is going to really infuriate surviving Pompeians, people like Brutus, people like Cassius. And we can add to that the Shakespearean crowning or attempted crowning of Caesar at the Lupercalia festival by Mark Antony that's deliciously given to us by Plutarch in his coverage of Caesar. Of course, Caesar's success, his dictatorship, his attitude of clementia and his reforms lead to that assassination plot, and Caesar is murdered on the 9th of March 44 BC as he walks in to a meeting of the Senate at the theatre of Pompey and supposedly dying at the foot of Pompey's statue. So we've got individuals very much challenging the Senate, but then we've always got a Senate reaction or a Republican reaction against them. So Sulla's laws eventually are all reversed. Pompey becomes absorbed into the Optimates and the senatorial faction and ends up fighting on their side. Caesar is assassinated. But the final individual I want to really focus on is one that I think has a lasting effect on the Republic to the extent that he permanently destroys the Republic, and that would be Octavian. And Octavian really emerges in the chaos of Caesar's assassination. And we do get some brief references to him in Cicero letters. We know that Octavian has not been in Italy during Caesar's assassination. He comes back to Italy. He finds out that he's been adopted as Caesar's son in his will. We know his mother Attia and his stepfather are against him accepting the adoption, but he does. We also know that Octavian starts to build up a considerable amount of support from Caesar's veterans, and it's this that makes him an asset to the Republicans that are concerned with the growing power of Mark Antony, and really more concerned with Mark Antony not being a Caesar number 2. We get a little view, a little hint about how split some figures were in regard to Octavian in Cicero's letter to Atticus on the 4th of November 44 BC, when Cicero says to Atticus, and of course he's incredibly trustworthy material when he's writing to Atticus about issues such as this. that he doesn't trust Octavian, that there's too many around him that threaten death to our friends. Now, we know that the Senate are going to give Octavian Pro-Praetorian Imperium in order to work with the two consuls, Hirtius and Pansa, to attack Mark Antony. And we know there's going to be a huge battle of Mutina. The two consuls are both killed at that battle, and certainly Suetonius and Tacitus certainly allege that Octavian is behind their murders. Our other writer that we're going to start to use now, Appian, who's writing far later than this period, which again allows him a degree of freedom in order to really sort of delve into this. And he's not subject to the propaganda constraints as if he would do if he was writing much earlier. Appian gives us the death to Octavian after the Battle of Mutina. And in it, he basically reinforces the idea that the Senate were trying to use Octavian and Antony against each other. And you can see that from the second paragraph from the bottom. The Senate, led by Cicero, their object was that we should take your two most effective legions, and they hoped that when one of you and Antony was defeated, the other would be weaker and lacking in allies. After destroying him, they would then eliminate all of Caesar's supporters and restore those of Pompey. This is their plan. So what situation has given rise to this? Well, of course, we've had Antony going to Cisalpine Gaul to take the province from Decimus Brutus by force. In 43 BC, we've got two fresh consuls, Hirtius and Pansa, and Octavian, who's been given Pro-Praetorian Imperium, sent by Cicero and the Senate in order to relieve Decimus Brutus at Mutina. At that battle, Antony is forced to flee, but unfortunately for the Republicans, Hirtius and Pansa are both killed. And it's at this point Cicero and the Senate start to move against Octavian by giving the triumph to Decimus Brutus, by giving the command to finish off Antony giving that command to Decimus Brutus and to Lepidus. And this is what provokes Octavian's march on Rome. So we've got Decimus Brutus and Lepidus sent. Octavian marches on Rome with his troops. I'm going to touch on that in a minute with what Appian says happens on that march to Rome. And at the same time, Decimus Brutus murdered by his own troops. Lepidus joins Antony, and eventually Octavian, after becoming consul and saying that they should really fight against Octavian, but then as soon as Octavian's forces arrive, they very quickly melt away. We've got here, this is really, really quite interesting, this part of the coin, which is again sort of giving us archaeological evidence of the Triumvirate and this triple dictatorship. Appian picks up the story of Octavian at the Battle of Philippi. And Octavian doesn't really come across positively, neither Suetonius or Appian in regard. But certainly Octavian starts to anger many in Rome, in particular the landowners, in regard to the promises that he's given to his troops and to his veterans. Of course, a very important step is Caesar's deification and Caesar being declared a god, because this now allows Octavian to claim that he is the son of a god. The director of the Imperial Archives with access to various different letters. In fact, in his actual coverage of this, there's some great letter material that's produced by Suetonius. We can see that Octavian again is acting pretty mercilessly to his defeated opponent. Met all for mercy with "you must die." 300 men sacrificed on the Ides of March to the deified Julius, and supposedly Suetonius says that he actually knew that this revolt was going to happen and lets it happen in order to expose his secret enemies. We've got Octavian increasingly working with his right-hand man Agrippa, and in 38 BC we've got a denarius issued by Caesar. Over here is Republican Imperator title, and also Agrippa being recognized as consul designate. Fast forward a little bit, and we've got some problems with Pompey's son Sextus Pompey in Sicily. Sextus Pompey had seized control of Sicily after Caesar's assassination. He built up a large navy. Octavian's twice defeated by Sextus Pompey. And Sextus's forces seized control of Sardinia and Corsica. And this means that because we've got a starving population and Roman military defeats, Octavian creates something called the Treaty of Misenum with Pompey. This results in something called the Battle of Naulicus. Agrippa, in the meantime, trains new fleets. Lepidus is asked to supply help. Sardinia and Corsica are betrayed to Octavian. And like I said, we've got this Battle of Naulicus. Takes place just off the coast on Sicily, where Sextus Pompey is defeated and flees. Lepidus, meanwhile, attempts a coup and tries to take control of Octavian's forces. It doesn't work, and as a result, Octavian steals his forces, and Lepidus has to go into exile. That's finally discussed by Appian in his coverage of the civil wars, with what Octavian was offering to his troops after the Battle of Naulicus, but also in particular to the Senate's attitude towards Octavian. And you can see that after the Battle of Naulicus, the Senate are incredibly incredibly positive towards Octavian. So Octavian is proclaiming peace, that the civil wars are finished, but then the Senate are trying to load Octavian with gifts and titles and various different declarations in order to get him to give up his extraordinary powers. So we've got a statue that's being offered to him with an inscription, which Appian says is still there. We've got the idea that Octavian says that he'll surrender his special powers when Antony comes back from the Parthian campaign. But crucially, we've got this last couple of sentences here. The Romans acclaimed him for this and made him tribune for life, encouraging him by the gift of permanent office to give up the previous one. But he took it in addition to the other and wrote independently to Antony about their power. This is very much an individual that's playing off the Senate and using the Senate for his own individual purposes. Whilst this is going on, we've got this increase in tension between Octavian in the west and Antony in the east. And Octavian in Rome goes to great pains to improve the situation of the city in regard to grain, aqueducts, the sewer system, some genuine improvements in the actual city itself. And we really get a great bit of information on this from Appian, but also the autobiographical Res Gestae. That contrasts with what's going on in the east with Plutarch and his coverage of Antony and Cleopatra in regard to issues such as the donations of Alexandria, the recognition of Ptolemy Caesar, and of course Antony's relationship with Cleopatra. The Plutarch account's really, really valuable because it gives us an insight into Antony's actions before Actium, as well as the breakdown of relations between Octavian and Antony, and this finally creates a situation where we're going to get the Battle of Actium. So, just to finish off, this topic is ripe. There's so much material we can use. There's so many different individuals we can discuss. The important thing, as ever, is to create a structure, to have examples, and to link those examples to the source material so we can positively analyze our sources and we can use them to discuss the issue that we're being asked about in regard to these individuals.